Thank you very much, Tarek. I think this was a wonderful, exciting talk. So you could have gone on a couple of more hours. What me concerns. But
I love the voice of the heat of my voice.
I think you demonstrated two things. First of all, the importance of historical knowledge when you think about the geopolitical situation of today. Without knowledge of what happened in the past, you can't understand the present, let alone say something intelligible about the future. And you also demonstrated that it is possible to give exciting talks without using PowerPoint. So thank you for that as well.
I hate PowerPoints.
Kurt, you will govern the question and answer set. So
I'm absolutely sure that you have blown many minds, so that you will have quite a lot of questions and kind of go about history, the region, politics, Islam, everything you want. He can answer. If not all your questions, then almost all your questions, Tarek. No. If you ask a question, there's a microphone in your seat, next to your seat, in your arm. So you have to open it up, take out the microphone, and if you want to talk, you have to push the button so that it will work. Okay, first questions.
First of all, thank you for the very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you something about what you said about the experience in Iran. You mentioned the 36-year experience with an Islamic government, and then that it's been looked at in the other parts of the Islamic world on whether or not it would succeed or how the experience has been in the last 36 years. But at least from my perception, the experience of having the Islamic government in Iran has led to somehow an anti-Islamic movement culturally. So you spoke about the civilization, and internally in Iran you would have somehow an anti-religious sentiment because of the, let's say, state-enforced religion. And would you say that somehow the outcome of this experience will reflect in the rest of the Middle East? So let's say this experience succeeds, as in they manage to continue existing, the Islamic Republic, or fails, would it then reverberate into Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and then further into Egypt, North Africa?
I saw a second question there in the back. Yes.
Thanks. I was impressed when you discussed the strong political role of the regimes in certain countries, and without asking you to look into a crystal ball, I was wondering, and I would still like to ask you, how high would you rate the possibility that those regimes or countries could come to clash?
I think that's enough for now.
On the first one, I agree, yes. If you follow the rhetoric, for example, of the demonstrations that took place in Tehran in 2009, and even recently, actually, yes, there's even the cultural movement of Iran. I'm a big fan of Iranian cinema. I don't know how many people here follow, but it's a fascinating cinema, actually. And some of the interviews that you do with, some people do with some directors, it's very clear that the message is any oppressive form of imposition of, again, the role of religion in society absolutely has created a backlash. In 2009, it was not a coincidence that the real center of opposition to the presidential election at the time was Tehran University. There is a reason why it came from the young. But it's always, in my opinion at least, and I do not want to sound dismissive, there's one thing about young activists, usually seculars, very tele-photogenic, speak nice languages, and you find them on the screens of big media stations, and they say, the people are against, and strong words, and how they fare in elections, and whether or not they are representative of very important part of the middle class, but not necessarily the widest parts of the middle class, especially the lower middle class. I think we have seen repeatedly, but I'm happy to be proven wrong, but in my assessment, that yes, there is a very secular movement, anti-establishment, anti-Islamic Republic, Iranian Islamic Republic in Iran. Absolutely, it's super clear. But whether it can motivate large and wide sections of the Iranian society to really go against the narrative of the Islamic Republic, so far we haven't seen that. You might say, of course we haven't seen it because the Islamic Iranian Republic was actually very oppressive on the other side. But also keep in mind proportionality. It's one thing what happened in 10 streets in Tehran versus many other streets where nothing happened. I mean, one of the most interesting things to me, at least, in the latest protests in Iran, is that the most important segments in Iran, the merchant class, hardly ever went to the street. I mean, that says something, to my mind at least. So I'm not dismissing your point. I agree. It's just I'm questioning the scale of it. But your second part of the question, I think, is the more difficult part, and I have no answer to it, and I'll be lying if I say I have an answer to it, which is whether what's happening in Iran could inspire or not, at least that's how I understood your question, other parts like neighboring places. It is already inspiring small groups. So it's inspiring Bahrain, which has a majority Shia population, inspiring the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, which is majority Shia. Certainly inspiring parts of Lebanon, obviously, which has a big Shia community. But whether this is really inspiring in the Middle East or not, I'm not particularly sure. But the really important point, I think, for me at least, and back to Muhammad Khatami, back to the late 90s in Iran. It was not Muhammad Khatami himself, but people around him put something very interesting forward, which I found fascinating, actually. Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, was always dismissive of the idea of Persian civilization. I mean, this is a wonderful 2,000 plus years civilization, and Khomeini was not particularly interested in that. His narrative, his message, his command was all based on his definition of Islam, and specifically on the life of the Prophet Muhammad and of the Shia imams, the leaders. So a very religious way of putting things. And for him, the Persian civilization is like a background, really. What happened inside the religious establishment in Iran, especially some people, some very important people around Muhammad Khatami, was fascinating. Because what they tried to do was to marry the Islamic Republic with the idea of Persianness. That's why you found, effectively for the first time in the late 90s, early 2000s, actually, not late 90s, very national big celebrations of the Nowruz, the very famous Persian celebration, of strong interest in the Iranian cinema by the state. You can say, of course, because they like the dollars that it brings to the country. It's also nice success, more or less. It's all over the place and winning in Cannes and what have you. But there was, it's a certain. I mean, I know there was an intentional approach of trying to win over the young Iranians by saying the Islamic Republic is wide enough to incorporate Iran's wonderful civilization heritage. That message proved very interesting and had resonance in other parts of the Arab world, certainly in the thinking of people such as leaders within Al-Nahda, for example. Certainly, there's no doubt to my mind about that. So here comes the political resonance, if you'd like. I hope that answers your question. On the question about the clashes, yeah, I have no doubt that we haven't seen the end of the clash. If that's your question, I have no doubt that we have not seen the end of the clashes on a religious, or in which religion is deployed, politicized, and weaponized in that part of the world. Right now, we are more or less in a lull, if you'd like, because people in different confrontations in the region have a fatigue. I think you find in North Africa, there's a fatigue from politics. Even in very hot places, such as Syria itself, there's certainly a fatigue of within the real powers, as opposed to people striking from outside. But the people on the ground, there is fatigue. There's also lots of resources that have been deployed. So I think we'll find a bit of a lull, a bit of a soft phase in terms of wars, which is very seductive for players such as the European Union, for example, and some players in Europe, because they can say, yes, that's the time when we go back now and let's put forward some political solutions to some confrontations. I really wish all the luck to these efforts. But the fundamental issues remain there, and especially the role of religion. And one final food for thought, I'll just throw it as something maybe of interest to some people. If the theological thinking, innovations that some people are thinking about takes hold in the Middle East, some people will find this wonderful and evolution and reformist, but some people will see it as an attack on the heart of the religion. And this will lead to very serious confrontations as well. So I'm afraid the answer is, in my view, not really seeing a crystal ball, but I'll be surprised if we can say the last 7 years really have exhausted most of the real reasons of clashes, especially between established regimes and forces that have very different ideas about identity, about future, about the state-citizen contract, about social contract, about the role of minorities versus the rights of majorities, about the role of Islam in society. So
more questions? Yes.
Maybe to expand on the conflictual part, because clearly in the Middle East, the big two powers are Iran versus Saudi Arabia, so Shia versus Sunni, etc. And we see a lot of proxy wars and conflicts going on, Lebanon, Yemen, etc. Do you see, as you mentioned yourself, the Ottomans, the crumbling of empire and the defining moment in the spread of Islam, and development of Islam happened after the French, let's say, invaded Egypt.
Yes, we can blame the French on everything.
Yeah, sorry.
We can blame the French.
So basically, the question is, do you see this coming to this massive, conflict between Shia, Sunni, Saudi Arabia, Iran at some point, which will be yet another major crossroad that will influence the development of Islam in the Middle East?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, first of all, for your talk. And I have different questions that I will try to put together in one. I would like to know if you think that the idea that you expressed at the beginning of the Arab world and Islam taking the best from the Western society, gold, is still alive, and if this may have a reflection in what you said is now happening in Morocco. Thank you.
Third one, yes.
Excuse me, could you give some examples of the theological innovations that you mentioned towards the end of your talk?
The proof is in the pudding now, Tarek.
That pudding specifically is different. Let me start by the Sunni Shia thing. I actually disagree with. Let's put it this way. I don't want to mislead by saying that Iran, Saudi is Sunni Shia, in my view at least. There is an element of that. I'm not the kind of observer who says, Sunni Shia relations are wonderful, actually, if we leave them to people, just that the regimes are very bad. No. There is of course tension, historical tension, absolutely. And there is serious parts of the Saudi regime, Saudi structure, I don't know now, but at least until very recently, that saw itself as a guardian of Sunni Islamism, as that is very, very integral part of its role, especially outside Saudi Arabia. And there's no doubt that there's a very important and integral part of Islamic Iranian Republic's structure that is anchored on its view of Shiaism. And therefore, by default, if this is true, then by default, the geostrategic confrontation, competition, struggle between the two has an element, of course, of that. But I emphasize geostrategic. To my mind, it is very much a geostrategic struggle between two very important countries with opposing interests, in which the two regimes see the other as an existential threat to some extent, in which the Sunni Shia dimension is an element because of what I said, and certainly it is again weaponized. There's no doubt about that. And it's very weaponized through proxy wars. So it's never weaponized directly. Otherwise, you would have a war. But it is very much weaponized through proxies. And you can see that in Yemen, you can see that in Iraq, you have seen that in Lebanon at one point in time, and different examples. And by default, if you follow my thinking, at least in my view, then there is no Sunni-Shia confrontation that will shape the future of Islam. In my view, I actually don't see that at all happening. That does not mean that there will not be confrontations, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, in which Sunni-Shia dimension is there. As I said, but not that it is going to lead to Sunni-Shia confrontation. It's the opposite. It is an element and being weaponized, hardly more than that, in my view. I don't know. You raised a very tough question. The point about whether the Islamic world, and especially the Arab world, still sees gold or not. To be very honest, the West has not been shining a lot recently. So I'm not sure that you'll find lots of people who are seeing lots of gold. And I say that as somebody who loves Europe, and I am a very regular visitor. I mean, Kirk, I hope you would agree, I don't know, that I actually really, really have a very strong appreciation of the West's experience, Europe specifically, actually not the West, Europe's specific experience in the last 400 years. I think it's a fascinating experience for anybody who studies history. It's a wonderful experience, and I think it's a wonderful human experience. Yet, I see many things happening in Europe right now, and I'm not going to draw many details, but not just elections in different countries, but even thinking, movements and rhetoric in countries that, to be very blunt, that I'll be politically incorrect. There are some countries that you can say that their developmental experience in Europe was not amazing, or was relatively limited, or they're still a bit poor, and therefore they haven't gone through a very long democratization process for too long, and therefore, but actually at the hearts of liberal Europe, of the places that have gone through 400-500 years of very serious modernistic, is that the word? I don't know, I was reading Candide recently, actually. And you're like, this was written, 17 what? So I'm not particularly sure, to be very honest, that the West, and specifically Europe, America is very different. Also, our as Arabs specifically, our experience with America is very unique because of different things. But our experience with Europe, and that was the point I started with, was not negative, was actually very positive. It became negative in a certain period of time, but also it turned very positive. In the 60s, for example, the Europe-Arab world experience was very, very inspiring, especially during de Gaulle's time, for example. There were immensely good relationships between many Italian socialist movements and later on the Christian Democrats and others with the Arab world. Europe was hardly ever the opposite / the enemy. Hardly ever, actually. But right now, is it inspirational enough for many people in the Arab world? To be honest, I would doubt that. But also keep in mind that the relativity has changed. In the 19th century, many people were looking at Paris and Vienna and Roma, and there was this wow. Until today, I mean, Kirk lived in Cairo and would know that very well. There's still this love for, we in Egypt, and Lebanese have it for Lebanon, the Damascenes had it in Damascus before the destruction, of the Belle Epoque parts of these countries. And we always looked at it as the beautiful gold. We used to call it the Golden Age, by the way. Not just because the streets were nice and more like the Rivoli in Paris. And it's more than that. There was a moment when we thought we got really the best of you and more or less merged it really nicely with what we think is the best of us and turned something very beautiful, or at least seemed very beautiful. But at the time, there was the wow moment to Europe. To be very honest, because there has been massive developments in our side, the developmental and, you can say an economic gap has shrunk a lot, actually, especially at the upper middle classes, a lot. And therefore, the wow factor is hardly there. Simply. But also keep in mind that the European responses, and I don't want to sound too negative on Europe, but the European responses to many challenges in Europe itself, let alone in our part of the world, was also not really very inspiring, to be very honest. That will take us to European politics, but there is certainly people much better than I am in the room to speak about that. Morocco, you chose the right... Sorry, I'm just jumping the second part of your question, because you said and whether that has any impact on the experience in Morocco. Morocco is a good example, actually, in which that you selected. Because Morocco is arguably, with Tunisia, but I would say Morocco is slightly more, is probably the most country in that part of the world, including Turkey, and that's important, including the country that has application to enter the European Union. Even with Turkey, Morocco is more advanced, in my assessment, in terms of seeing Europe as a destination, or seeing parts, that's probably a big statement, seeing parts of Europe, part of the European experience as a destination. But more importantly, not from an economic point of view. And I think this is the important point, because most people you speak to in Turkey, and again, maybe people here know Turkey much better than I do, look at the European experience, at least in the last 20 years, from the point of the customs union with the European Union, the access of Turkish goods to the European Union, foreign direct investments into Turkey coming from Germany and what have you. This is not really what inspires people. This is money. This is politicians' point of, if you do that, I'll do that, and therefore I'll create 2,000 work jobs here, and therefore I'll win this constituency in the next election. Fair and nice, but this is different from a country which I say Morocco is a good choice, in which many, maybe not a majority, but really many, even funny enough, even within the Islamist movement, so even within the PJD, and that's quite interesting. And actually, I was in Morocco very recently, even within the PJD, that see a lot of interactions with Europe culturally, in which they would love to have engagement with. But maybe a final point here is that keep in mind that Morocco is the largest country in the Arab world in terms of demographic representation and integration with Europe. Percentage-wise, the number of Moroccans who are now Europeans, whether they're doing well or not, different story, but who are now Europeans in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, compared to the Moroccan population, is actually very large. And there's a lot of interaction. So you can argue maybe that there is a human experience here that made that exposure to Europe positive. I don't know if that answers you, but I was just rambling, thinking around. On the theological thing, to be very honest, I will not go into it for two reasons. One is that I'm not doing real research on it in any way, so I'll be giving you a layman view. But I'll give you one thing that I find fascinating, actually. Without getting into too much details, also because they're very sensitive, to be very frank. But some ideas that one of the most important growth trends, if you'd like, in religiosity in the Arab world is Sufism, is this idea of looking at religion through a very spiritual way of connecting with God. And even the definition of Allah, of how do you see God, takes a very interesting dimensions and very varied dimensions when you speak to different Sufi schools of thought. And that has always been the case for centuries in the Arab world and in Turkey, not in Iran. Well, very limited in Iran, but primarily in the Sunni world, shall we say, primarily. For the past 20 years or so, there have been lots of Sufi schools of thought, as in not official schools of thought, that have borrowed some interesting ideas from the East. And the East here, I mean India, I was talking to a friend, Morgan, before coming here about yoga. And there has been actually some very interesting things happening in which you hear somebody talking and you're like, that doesn't sound too Islamic to me. I mean, I studied Islam quite well. There's lots of mergers here. And you find young people who are merging concepts of how they see the divine, how they see the essence of the religion, how they see even some of the real basic tenets of Islam, with shades coming from different cultures. In the West, at least I'm drawing on two specific examples, in the Netherlands and in France, it's even beyond that, whereby some people are thinking about new definitions of basic stuff in Islam. But really, that, I'm being very frank, it is quite sensitive, and number two, it is quite detailed, and to give it some real, it's due, I will speak for 10 minutes to give you also what I think is the original view and how some people are seeing differently. But the important point here is that this is happening in the open. In France, in the Netherlands, as we speak right now, there are consistently women, just give you one simple example, who lead salah, who lead prayer, lead it, and who give publicly sermons in which they would question some things that have been basics of the religion for centuries. And you have people around them who are not secular activists, anti-Islam, no. They're actually very religious people, but they are interested in a different view, if you'd like. It is a bigger movement than what many people think. But as I said, I put it as just a point number 4. I don't want you to get the impression that Tarek is saying there's a Martin Luther King coming tomorrow. I didn't say that. It's just one of different elements that are very interesting within the evolution of the role of Islam in society, but it's happening primarily in the West. There are some things in the Middle East, and I said even in very conservative places, surprisingly Saudi Arabia is a fertile ground, by the way, or maybe not surprisingly. But at least what's in the open is in Europe.
I'm afraid it's 8:30. I see still a few hands up. I'm sure we can go on for 1 more or maybe 2 more hours, but I suggest that we end the discussion with one excellent point, being female imams. So, so I would like to thank you, Tarek, very, very much for this excellent
Thank you.
lecture. I want to thank you all for being here and being so very interested. And to invite you for the next and last lecture of this series, being the 25th of April. Mustafa Akyol, the journalist from Turkey, will come to talk about the future of Turkey. And no doubt, I mean, lots of points will certainly, what you have been said, will be put, I think, in a new context. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Tarek. Next time.